Welcome to the London Stock Exchange webinar on boardroom innovation. Why is innovation needed in the boardroom? There is hardly any doubt that given all the multiple points of pressure, the corporate governance profession has been undergoing some rethinking and recalibration. At the moment, we're seeing a stark example of just how quickly a conflict in one part of the world can send a ripple effect across a broad range of sectors of the global economy. This situation is unraveling just as the world is coming out of a major health and social crisis. So while there is no crystal ball that can tell us what's coming next, there are a few practical approaches companies can take to be prepared to face the unknown. We have a great panel with us today to discuss this topic, and we encourage our audience to ask questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of their screen. With us, we have Malin Lombardi, co-founder of BoardClic and director of Board and C-Suite Solutions. We have Rob Manson, sales director UK at BoardClic as well. We have Oliver Cummings, CEO of Nurole, and we have Neem Corbett, Board Intelligence. My first question is to Malin of BoardClic. What do you see is the impact on boards of what's going on in the world today? And specifically, how does it impact strategic big picture objective setting?
That's a very interesting and very big question. Thank you, Katja. So at BoardClic, what we do is that we have an analytics platform that enables board and CEOs to create more value. And I would like to say that what has happened recently in board work is that it's, of course, become much more complex due to all the things that you mentioned before. And I mean, in addition to that, you can say that a lot of companies are changing their business models as we speak, and there's war on talent, etc. So it's a very complex picture. I would say that I would make an example. A few months ago, a CEO that I know personally came to us and was very frustrated with his new board. Major changes had been made about a year ago, and he felt that the boardroom was just not functioning at all. So what we did was that we, through our data-led approach, we uncovered where the roadblocks were in the communication, and what it was about risk and risk appetite. There was just the management felt that the board was so risk adverse and so afraid of making mistakes that no decisions really could be made. And so, I mean, they are now much better off today. They've had a lot of work and we've done on that and aligning on that. And also, it wasn't all the board's fault. It's also very hard to be on the board when you just there's no standardization on risk descriptions. You get all this risk reported to you. If a company is reporting 400 risks, how can risk mitigation be successful? So, I mean, the CEO also got some homework to do. But I would say in general, that's the risk we have today, that you fall into too much of a defensive board and that you don't move. And that's what we see the best boards fight against in different ways. I would say that what you need to do is become more forward-leaning. You need to be working together as a team, and you would need to work with the management towards one single goal. And what we see is that boards need to work with many more scenarios in the past. I mean, in the past, maybe you could do work with one or two scenarios. Now you do need to do it with many more than that. And that, of course, also will affect the people that can be on boards. You probably need more, a broader base of directors in order to be successful at this. And also, it will take more time.
So, Malin, in the context of the broader role in society that companies are expected to play, with broader collective responsibility of the board and the commitments expressed via corporate purpose, how do you see that this shift to stakeholder governance is affecting the role of the board?
I think this is very interesting. I think it's all about role clarity and the role of the board, as you said, and it is about, one is about looking at the competence on the board. Are they ready to deal with this, to take the leadership of these issues in the companies that the now authorities and investors and society are actually asking them to do? It's not enough anymore to have one climate or ESG director, the full board needs to have at least some sort of knowledge of these, and they need to see that they are aligned about what this means to them. So, and of course, they need to really pause and establish who the relevant stakeholders are.
Thank you, Malin. Neem, may I turn to you next? What do you see are the implications of the wider remit that ARGA is expected to play once there is the transformation of the FRC into ARGA is complete?
Sure. No, it's a very good question. And in fact, it sort of hangs on the premise that we assume the changes in the form that they've been previewed are going to come through. Because that wider remit and those planned changes, it's been a long time coming, and ultimately they are being made for the right reasons. Because certainly in our view, the FRC has long been more than just a reporting council. And actually, given that the UK has one of the leading governance codes in the world, it's sort of madness that hasn't been overseen. That has been overseen by the part of the FRC that doesn't actually have any powers to slap companies on the wrist if they aren't meeting any of the requirements. So it very much, that increased responsibility around governance very much makes sense. And it's great to see more resource and focus being put there as well. But secondly, I would say the question ends up coming down to whether you think governance and the flip side of governance reporting, which is very much board intelligence's world, we are board reporting specialists, whether you think that governance and reporting leads to better outcomes for organisations. And what we've seen at Board Intelligence, literally before our eyes, is that better information, and actually often driven by regulation or governance, can lead to companies being more agile, more fleet of foot, more strategic, more innovative, and actually more focused on the right things. So with all that in the round, the widening of ARGA, if it makes companies take that more seriously, can only be a good thing.
Thank you, Neem. Oliver, what do you see are the implications of this context that we're facing on what the boards are, on the environment that the boards need to be prepared to operate in?
Yeah, I think in addition to the points Malin made around being an increasingly complex world, I think it's also become a less forgiving one. And where board members are sort of facing trial by court of public opinion, and if you get it wrong now, you get tarred for life and worse. So I think what you're seeing is a greater professionalization and a greater need for expertise on boards who can ask the right questions. I remember when we first started Nurole, I would have sort of discussions with chairs of sort of in the listed space who would come to us and say they were just looking for someone high caliber, someone who would be a good fit, and you wouldn't have that sort of discussion today, that sort of blinkered thinking. And equally from the candidate side, as a result, I think it's becoming more competitive. Occasionally we get board members coming to us and say they have more luck getting board roles going through the direct to chairs or through traditional headhunters, and you look at their profile, and actually when you look at it, you realize they're just not as good as others out there. And so I'll often say to them, look, keep going through those paths for as long as you can, because as soon as those organizations figure out that they how to run a professional process, you're going to miss out. So it's on both sides of the coin that it's changing.
Thank you. I would like to next explore the concept of board effectiveness in this evolving context. So I would like to turn to Neem. Of course, another point of pressure is the realization and the acceptance that addressing stakeholders' needs and priorities is inextricably linked to the company's long-term health and success. So what are some of the practical ways companies have been responding to the challenge to embed stakeholders in their big decision-making process?
Sure. And actually, almost before we get to the practical ways that we've seen companies responding to it, I would say that stakeholder engagement isn't necessarily a new thing, but the only stakeholders that we've seen boards consistently engage with and that they can be considered to have done well are employees and investors. That you could argue that engaging with investors is relatively easy because companies have been doing it for years. Engaging with any other stakeholders outside of employees and investors is hard, and certainly we're not sure that any boards can really say that they've cracked it. But actually, it's not a new concept, and we've had chairs say to us that, of course, you're going to engage with stakeholders, it's just good business. But the challenge is that engaging with stakeholders by definition means it's ongoing. I mean, you need a dialogue. And that's an area that we've seen many boards actually be slightly uncomfortable with, is that ongoing dialogue, because they have less control over where that dialogue will go. Some have done it as a consultation, and that actually defeats the purpose, because the consultation, the way they do it is almost, we will ask a question, you will answer it, we will listen to what your answer is, we will think about it, that will be the end of the conversation. It is ultimately, and in the ways that we've seen boards come up with creative ways to tackle this, it's about creating and maintaining that dialogue. So in terms of, at a high level, how we've seen boards come up with various ways of tackling this, we've seen shadow boards be created that have involved that employee voice. That shadow board has come about in a couple of different ways. It can either be a junior board with younger members on the board that act as that pipeline for board members. It can be an advisory council that's selected from employees. It can be a panel of outside technical experts, but really giving that forensic focus. In terms of practical ways that we've seen boards do this, it is, I mentioned that forensic focus, it's really driving that focus on stakeholders throughout the organization, making sure that whatever the type of organization, it thinks critically and communicates effectively, both about and to its stakeholders. And it's really asking at the forefront of how they think about what they do. It is asking, what are the key questions that we need to be asking and therefore answering in our organization about our stakeholders, and embedding that thinking and really driving that insight and putting that and those key questions about stakeholders and considerations up front in the way that it's reported. On a much more practical note, one way we've seen do that is every paper that goes, whether it goes to a management committee or whether it goes to the board, has almost a one-page tick box for each stakeholder that has been considered, that then can be tracked over time. So that way the board and the management team get almost a trend analysis of how stakeholders have been considered and the dialogue in the organisation. But to sum up, I would say crucially, it is about finding practical ways to maintain that dialogue between the board and between their stakeholders.
Thank you for raising this important point, because as you said, it's not only how to structure this dialogue, but where it's going to go, really, how it's going to inform boardroom discussions and decision making, and how it's going to then translate into new objectives for management teams. I would like to turn to Rob next. Looking into implementation challenges, I understand that BoardClic has a unique data set on some of the challenges that boards face. So if you could share with us what your data tells us.
Absolutely, thank you, Katja, and you're absolutely right. So we do have an incredibly unique data set, and this is a prime example of it, where we have actually collated responses from over 2,000 boards across Europe and quite heavily in the UK, and we have tracked mentions of what the single largest challenge in strategy implementation will be over the next 2 years. So it's a very forward-focused perspective onto these challenges. And the results that we see are quite insightful. We see, tracking from 2019 to the current day, the single biggest challenge in strategy implementation that we see now has actually increased by 197% since 2019, and that is growth and sales related challenges. So board members are expressing that it is ever more important to, it's always important, but now it's really on top of mind, and it's ever more important to execute the new market penetrations, understanding behavioral shifts in consumers in purchasing. How can you keep selling to younger generations as the business proceeds? And the new and existing buyer perspectives are more important to understand. So these are becoming more and more mentioned. As I said, 193% increase over 3 years. If we add on top of this the issues that are arising with pricing and positioning your business in the market, it's becoming ever more difficult to do so. And we hear that there are more mentions of this in the current day. And this is based on, of course, the mass inflation that we are seeing, but also the transparency of pricing. You know, how can you analyze competitive pricing, and how can you position yourself in the market? So these are becoming ever more important and an even stronger challenge in the implementation of strategy. Now, more familiarly to many, we're seeing people in ESG, which are huge topics at the moment. So those have had consistent ascending trends through 2019 to now, and we expect them to continue to do so. But looking on the flip side of this data to what was the leading challenge of 2019, which was a head and shoulders above the others of digital transformation, is now actually decreased by 60% across these boards. Now, this is by no means saying that digital transformation has been and done. It is still, these are all still the largest challenges to strategy implementation that boards are facing. But what we are experiencing is, because this is a future focused question, we are experiencing a bit of a lag from the data collection to what we actually see in practice. So now the digital transformation, digital competencies, they are in full swing, and they are all currently occurring as we experience it. But we were likely to see that change over the next 2 years with growth in sales. I think one of the interesting points to follow up with this is that we actually, within these questions we are asking, we have followed up with asking about competencies that are required in the board over the next 2 years, again, a very future focused question. And these mirror the strategic challenges. So we are expecting to see more growth and sales marketing related competencies needed on the boards in the coming few years.
Thank you, Rob.
You're welcome. The slide we can move back to normal view now.
Thank you, Rob. So if we translate these challenges into action points, Oliver, what do you see that boards are doing in response?
And one of the big things that boards are thinking about as they tackle sort of effectiveness is, how do they break down the sort of groupthink and the risk of groupthink as they try to look around corners. And a big part of that is around the diversity of skills, background, personal strengths that they bring into their board. And some of the sort of initiatives that we see have already been touched on, things like next generation boards, where you get your next generation of up and coming stars getting the same materials as the main board, and having a main board member sit on that and feed those insights in. Board apprentices, having people who are not yet ready to take on a board sit in on the board, as well as sort of reverse mentoring. I think one of the big trends that I can only see growing is the use of advisory boards. So without fiduciary responsibilities, they can be set up quickly on specific problems and can be changed out more regularly. So we had a nice example recently of a sort of AM 100 law firm who set up what they called an independent strategic advisory board, and it was composed of a former EY global vice chair, venture capital investor, and a long-time corporate strategic advisor, and they reported into the CEO. And you know that they were a firm of lawyers, but they didn't have anyone who was not a lawyer bring them the diversity, and it was focused purely on how do we grow internationally. So we can see that is going to only grow.
Thanks, Oliver. So coming back to the main topic of the webinar about this ability to innovate that will enable boards to be more responsive to rapid change that's coming. Perhaps, Malin, if you could share some examples of how innovation can help boards to respond to these changes in both external and internal business environment.
Well, I think we mentioned it a lot during this webinar, but of course, what is happening is that time is really scarce for boards. More and more things are loaded onto the board agenda, and not that much is taking off. So what boards are doing are, of course, finding new ways to make sure that they cover it all and in an efficient way. And we've heard about shadow boards, advisory boards, etc., but also board committees, of course. We see new board committees, temporary or permanent. ESG is one example, because what also tends to happen, which is maybe not the most recommended path, but what is very common, is that all these new things get they put them into the audit or audit and risk committees, and that can work, but it of course means that the workload increases a lot there. But it also means that the directors on the audit committee have one particular background, and of course they're very used to dealing with financial risks, but other risks, when you come to ESG or cybersecurity, etc., it's not as self-evident that that's where they belong. So I think the use of other kind of committees, board committees, or with outside participants or from the company, that's something that we see innovative companies do. And I would also just like to stress that what the best performing boards have been successful at doing during the past years is to not go too much into crisis mode and COVID-19 response, or etc. They've done that as well. Everybody's been doing that, but they've kept time for forward-looking and value-creating work. And some boards actually turn the typical board meeting agenda on its head, and the classical agenda on its head, and so they make sure that they have enough time for what actually creates value, and of course keeping on doing what all that they need to do.
Thanks, Malin. I would like to move to assessing the boards. I would like to turn to Neem. What's new in the ways boards are assessed in terms of effectiveness, and what are some of the measures of internal accountability to ensure that the outputs of discussions in the boardroom are followed through, and they become deliverables for the executives, and then they become subject to financial and non-financial reporting?
Sure. Well, I'm not sure it's wildly new, but it's certainly something that we have seen the more successful boards focusing on. And that is looking at how they can align themselves around their core priorities and using those to hold themselves accountable. And we have a model at Board Intelligence that reflects this, and it's called the 6 conversations model. And that looks across strategy, performance, and governance at those key cornerstone conversations, things like, are we working in the right way? Are we delivering our numbers? Do we have the right strategy? That the board should be having over the course of a year. These key cornerstone conversations then reflect themselves in the board agendas, and then subsequently whether those agendas flow down into the executive agendas and into the organisation, but subsequently in the reports then that go to the board and inform the work and the focus of the executive. But actually it doesn't end there, because we see so often there are 2 key things that are missing. One is a feedback loop, and that's what we call input sort from the board, that there is often so much information goes to the board. People's natural tendency is to just kitchen sink everything, bombard board directors with information. But we so rarely, almost if ever, sometimes see writers, and in many cases that's the executive, getting feedback from the board on whether their paper was fit for purpose and whether it allowed the board to have the right conversations. Boards similarly will often find themselves almost surrounded by all this information, but they don't know what they're meant to be doing with it. They don't know what the input sort is. What do the exec want back from them? So there's that disconnect that is starting to make that issue of accountability much harder, when neither side is 100% clear on what they're meant to be doing with that information. So we say being very clear upfront, the ask of the board and the key questions that the board needs to be answering is that first step from both sides, both the board and the executive, to holding themselves to account and to aligning themselves around that cornerstone conversations, that key set of priorities of their areas of focus.
Thank you. Rob, well, how do you see board evaluations evolving to address all the challenges that we've discussed so far?
Thank you, Katia. And they are evolving very rapidly, actually. And this is to do with a lot of the digital transformation that we have experienced. But, and I can speak about this topic, it's what we do at BoardClic. I can speak about board evaluations for a very long time, but I will keep it down to three main points that I have experienced personally. And it ties in very well with what's been discussed by my other panelists here. Time in the boardroom is always of the essence. The agenda is filling up. There's a lot more work to be done. So having a board evaluation that is time efficient is just like now a hygiene factor. It cannot be onerous to board members to take part in a board evaluation. It has to have this incredibly valuable output with as much of a minimal input time commitment as you can possibly get. The second point that I've noticed is very much based on the rapidly changing environment that we're working in, but it is the increase in frequency of board evaluations. And this ties in with the first point on the time effectiveness. If you can reduce the time it takes to actually conduct a board evaluation whilst maintaining the output, you can conduct two, and we are seeing a huge amount of our users actually conduct two board evaluations within 1 year. And in many cases, it's a full board evaluation with a subset of themes or topics from the primary board evaluation to conduct that string of data and to compound data throughout the year. So you can actually have two perspectives. You can see how the tracking has changed over that time, and then you can use that data in a compounded way to actually make more value-adding assessments and trend analysis into the effectiveness of the board. The final point is extrapolating this slightly further, actually. So we very rarely see or very rarely hear requests for one-off board evaluations. That's now pretty much become a thing of the past. We are only hearing about 3 to 5 year board evaluation processes. So this continuity is so heavily sought after to be able to take that one-off process, extrapolate it over multiple years, compound the data further, and actually add value exponentially the more you add to this data bank that you have within the organization. And that evaluation, they're looking for sustainable and consistent processes that you can tweak and match depending on that particular year and what requirements are needed, either on a compliance side or regulatory wise. I think the three of those to me really come down to one overview of a shift in mindset towards the board effectiveness review. And of course, there's a lot of compliance and regulatory components that are included in that, and we need that in there. But I'm seeing a shift of mindset away from the board effectiveness review being a compliance exercise. And it has to be now a purely developmental process. It has to add value, and it has to be a continuous improvement that builds a more effective board rather than a tick in the box for compliance.
Thank you, Rob. I would like to next go into the topic of boardroom culture. It's not just something that's nebulous. It's very much the DNA of decision making, and in practical ways, it determines the quality of what's going on of boardroom discussions, and even in more tangible ways, drives the quality of reporting. So I would like to turn to Malin to discuss what's new in this area and how does boardroom culture in general determine board effectiveness.
But I would say, of course, it is crucial to get the full outputs of these very competent people that you recruit to boards. Of course, the culture needs to work. And I would say today it's very much about encouraging a culture of courage and speed in transformation, because that's what's needed. And you also need to have a sense of urgency on the board. And another thing, and of course, I mean, in this, the chairman is very important. We see again that many of the best chairs are looking to have board meetings feel more like workshops and less than a series of presentations. And in order to achieve this, of course, you need to have a culture where everybody's heard and everybody feels that they are contributing and feel that they are valuable. And you need to work closely with the executive management. So, well, we always tell our customers that you want the CEO to actually look forward to the board meetings, not the opposite.
And of course, culture determines who gets to be around the boardroom table. So from that perspective, of course, an effective board is, first of all, an informed board, knowledgeable about the needs and priorities of investors and wider stakeholders, and therefore able to challenge the executives in the right areas, to ask the right questions and to maintain quality discussions in the boardroom. So I would like to explore with Oliver what's new in terms of the areas of expertise and backgrounds that are being sought by the boards. What do you see in terms of the push to perhaps have stakeholder representatives around the boardroom table? So, and what's in general new in terms of succession planning and recruitment?
Gosh, a lot there. So I think the big thing was and continues to be the push on demographic diversity. It was gender and now more and more with ethnicity. Your FTSE 250 boards are now have been set the target of one ethnic minority board member by 2024. The FTSE 100 obviously did that. The last Park review almost did it. They were sort of at 89 out of 100 boards there. The FTSE 250 is about halfway there with only 128. But it was so just over half, and it was around a quarter back in 2019. So it's moved quickly, and it's only going to continue going. So there's going to continue to be huge pressure, and it's an interesting one when you look at the demographics of the UK, which is probably more relevant for the FTSE 250. But 8% of people often talk about 14% of the UK's population being sort of ethnic minority backgrounds, but actually if you look at that sort of 55 to 64-year-old group, which is the sort of where most board members are coming from, it's only 8%. So there's and when you look at the 0 to 4 age group, and this is based on the 2011 census, the recent one hasn't yet come out, but it was closer to 25%. So there's this massive change in the demographic coming through that boards are wrestling with, and so there's huge push for candidates who can represent that change. Besides that demographic piece, we're seeing a growing push for current executives, people with recent experience. I think it feeds back into some of the stuff we discussed earlier around how quickly things are changing. Suddenly, actually, people want people who are sort of current or recent CFOs who understand the current challenges. ESG we've touched on a lot. I mean, you're seeing organizations everywhere facing those sorts of challenges, and that's being something that's increasingly looked for. Digital we've talked about, and I think that's on two sides, partly on the growth side, sort of marketing as well as the sales, but also on the cyber data security side. Interestingly, surprisingly few of those people who are going onto those boards have actual pure play digital expertise. They tend to be more from digital organizations, which is a sort of an important difference. And then finally, the last one we're sort of starting to see at the moment is around talent. And again, it goes back to some of the macro stresses we talked about in the world of sort of hybrid working and high macroeconomic stresses. And as HR goes through that digital transformation that marketing once went through, and it dovetails nicely with the demographic trends, because we're seeing candidates who cross over that intersectionality of both bringing that expertise and demographic diversity, and all of that besides the ongoing demand for the classics, so around sort of finance, investment, listed company experience, and general sort of leadership experience. In terms of, I mean, there's less stakeholder push for sort of stakeholders from customer, competitor, supplier, or employee backgrounds, I'd say specifically, or certainly less that we see. And I think you've got some interesting sort of counter trends starting to pop up. You would have seen the California court that's recently thrown out the diversity quota, having questioned the causation versus correlation link. What's new? I think you asked around the sort of process of succession planning recruiting. I think it's fair to say a lot hasn't changed. So 4 out of 5 chair roles went to men in 2021. And when you look at what organizations are looking for, you know, they tend to be quite exclusive. And the board world does move slowly in some regards. You know, I'd like to think, you know, we've got some great examples of some of the big disruptions happening on the contributors on the panel. But obviously, the openness of hiring is a change. I think the last 3 reviews into diversity have all called for advertising more board roles, and we're seeing that as more and more people are getting comfortable with that. We're seeing more boards not meeting and doing digital interviews. And actually, I sort of talked to a lot of chairs who say they're struggling to get their board members in for the board meetings. They don't want to come in. It's not just at the executive level that's happening. I think composition is becoming increasingly important. But as the world gets more complex, your ability as a board to cover all the different angles that you need to cover is finite. You can't have a board that does everything. So it's becoming more and more of a puzzle. It's not just about the individual, but it's about how do they fit into the rest of the group. And when you think about the different dimensions you have to cover, that's become a raised thing. We're seeing board members skewing younger. So 40% board members are now sort of first time non-execs, which goes back, I think, to the recency. It also ties it back to the push on digital. We're seeing people getting better at planning ahead, starting to think about how do they build pipeline for their board members. We've also seen an interesting trend. There was a trend for a while towards having independence on some of the operating boards and pushing for sort of more separation. But actually, we've seen that sort of coming back more recently as people feel like actually it's important to have that alignment across the two to stay up to speed. And I think, you know, that ties in with a general focus on sort of overboarding and the increased complexity and time commitment that it takes from people. It's asking people for more and more time. I think those are probably the key things that we're seeing.
Thank you, Oliver. Malin, all these demographics, backgrounds, areas of expertise now around the boardroom table, presumably that translates into more challenge for chairs. So what do you see is changing in terms of the role of the chair in the boardroom?
Yeah, I also would like to follow up on something Oliver said, because we also see some contradictory trends. It's interesting, but speaking of that, of course, when you have decided to have a broader composition in the board, that means that the chairman needs to be more thoughtful and probably more mindful about the inclusivity and making sure that information is shared in a way that allows everyone to contribute. What we see when that doesn't work is that you have like A and B groups, almost of board members, or almost a board within a board, and that is of course not what you want to see. And those directors that have been, brought into those boards, they typically do not last because they don't feel that they are able to provide the value that they were brought there to provide. But I just wanted to say, because I think Oliver mentioned a bit about that, you see tendencies not necessarily all moving in the same direction, is that when we interview chairs, which we do all the time, there's a trend that they say that we need a broader composition in boards, and we need more people from outside of the business. So it's important to take in people from other worlds. But when we look at large amounts of data that we have on what boards and management team feel is missing on their boards, its sector competence and its competence from that particular sector. And that has been the same since we started measuring. So we see no change there, but when we speak to people, especially chairs, they speak a lot about the need for a broader, more people from outside of the sector, whereas it seems to, yeah, maybe the truth is that we still need both.
Thank you, Malin. Neem, what would you say is new in terms of boardroom composition, and what's the direction of travel for the roles of the chair, committee chairs, independent directors, and perhaps members of board committees and external advisors, as we touched on?
Sure. Well, I think a lot of it in terms of the specifics, Oliver and Malin have covered, but what I would say is new is the starting point. So instead of starting at who should be around the boardroom table, we are seeing a lot of firms start to look and do quite a lot of work around their governance structure and looking at its efficiency and agility, and in particular looking at duplication and repetition of roles, of forums, and of information, because it's one of the things that we've noticed post-pandemic, especially with highly regulated industries, is that committee bloat. The committees have been created, and yes, there are some focus committees we've touched on already: responsible business committees, ESG committees, climate committees. But actually, in terms of how that fits into the overall governance structure, we're seeing a lot of bloat and a lot of inefficiencies. So the starting point that we're seeing boards look at is almost, how are we set up? What are those forums? What are the roles? Where is the duplication? And then therefore, what is the right and appropriate amount and level of detail of information that goes to each of that? And almost, once someone mentioned it earlier in the panel, the time pressure that's on boards. Once they're able to get their governance house in order and have a governance structure that works for them, then they're starting to look at who then is around the boardroom table and how that then flows down into who are on the committees and what the roles of the committee chairs are, how that reflects the delegated authorities, but also how that reflects what Oliver touched on, the need for specialist expertise, be that technical experts, be that advisory boards, or be that broader committees. But actually it's looking at how do we make sure that we're working in an agile way. We're not just setting up a committee or a forum for its own sake.
Thank you, Neem. So next, would like to bring it all together and discuss the definition of success in this new context. Of course, it's hardly a static concept, and it will be tested as the new circumstances evolve. So would like to turn to Rob first. What does success in the boardroom, how would you define it, and who should be accountable for it?
It's a very good question, and there's I'm sure many definitions of success that can be derived of this. I think from my perspective, what drives success, I'm going to change the question slightly, but what drives success, I would say, is alignment on the board. I think having a cohesive board that works as a unit rather than a group of individuals, being aligned on priorities in the board is essential, and that cohesive unit approach is always going to drive success, and from my perspective, the full board should be held accountable for the success of the company.
Thank you. Neem.
Sure. Again, what does success in the boardroom look like? It's such a broad question, but increasingly a definition that we are seeing boards hold themselves to of it is it's about agility, and it's about having an agile board that are focused on the right things and they're having the right conversations. And through doing both of those things, they're demonstrating transparency and accountability. So I guess going on from that, in terms of what the definition of a good board is and what they do, it focuses on a few things. It focuses on constantly sharpening and applying that definition of a few things. Why does the company exist? Who does it serve? And how can it win? And these are very basic, fundamental questions. And you would imagine that all boards are tackling them. But we've seen boards address these questions once a year in a strategy away day, and then they're not returned to for another year. These are the questions that should be returned to again and again through every board topic, with the intent of making the best possible evidence-based decision. And almost reflecting on that, when we ask our chairs, I guess the sub-question to what is a good board and what's a success like for a good board is, what is the marker of a good board meeting? It's that. It is a meeting that moves the conversation on, and that conversation is one that moves the company on. In terms of practically how we've seen boards do that, so measures of success are much broader than they used to be, and particularly in ESG and alternative valuation metrics, actually really trying to hone down on what are the true and correct metrics that you can look on to assess whether a board is successful or not. One of the things that we are starting to see boards look at and use a lot more is a dashboard. So that is a one-page performance top slice across the company. It includes both financial and non-financial reporting and looks at those key metrics across strategy, performance, and governance that really acts as the tip of the information pyramid that then focuses attention both from the board and the executive down into how the business is actually operating and going back to those key cornerstone conversations, but also the key strategic questions that boards are answering, how management are executing on that. That is what we're seeing as a way of giving that transparency that holds both the board and the executive to account.
Absolutely. Oliver, what is success to you in this context?
Yeah, for me, one of my favorite definitions was a chair once said to me, a great board is one which provides the highest return on time invested for the executive in any given month or quarter. And I think for too many, the board is something to be suffered or dysfunctional. It surprises me more and more now how few boards there are that actually are functional. Another sort of exec once sort of said their sort of summation of it was the 4 C's, where that it's about collaboration, which comes from teamwork and trusted relationships, which is getting really hard to do now in this hybrid environment. It's about competence. So we talked a lot about the experts required across multiple fields and people having that mutual respect for each other's domains. It's about courage, to be able to challenge without being challenging and disagree without being disagreeable. And then that final piece is around chemistry. And that's what comes when you get those first 3. And for me, it all starts with the chair. If the chair is wrong, you'll never get it right.
Thank you, Oliver. Malin?
So I think I agree with everything that's been said, but I think that the main thing is, of course, that a board is successful if it's a crucial part of the success of the company, and that is what it needs to be. And I would say when you get it wrong, there are many ways to get it wrong, but what we see is that probably over the years, almost half of all the boards evaluated in our platform and in the previous consultancy firm that we base this on, they weren't clear about their role. And I think that's very interesting. Also, it also means that they aren't really clear about the purpose often, and they really never had that discussion. Like, what are we as a group? What are we here for? What should be our legacy of this particular board? And I think that's very interesting because if you don't, how can you fulfill your duties if you don't really know what they are? So I think that would be a practical tip. And with ESG, I think this is even more, become even more evident now when they need to tackle the ESG requirements as well.
Thank you, Malin. We're nearing the end of our webinar. So I would like to ask you just for a few practical points of advice that we can leave our audience with. Rob, starting with you.
Thank you. I think one of the most surprising areas that I've experienced, and when speaking to both individual board members and chairs on quite a scale, the thing that surprised me the most was the feedback we received on conducting individual feedback to board members, conducting peer reviews to understand how these high-performing individuals that are steering the company, how can we all improve ourselves from the perspective of your peers on the board? And when looking through these multi-year evaluations that are being conducted, we see enormous increases and significant increases from boards that are also conducting peer reviews for personal development as well. It can be quite scary at first to have individual assessments or take part in individual assessments, although the experience we've had is that they are incredibly value adding to the individual and the board as a unit. So I would say, as a point of an additional point, to conduct individual feedback to your board members.
Thank you, Rob. Oliver?
Yeah, I think maybe two things. One, on diversity. We often get organizations coming to us saying, look, we're looking to improve the diversity of our board. And then they will get a whole load of diverse candidates, and sometimes the reaction would be, oh, they're not like us. And it's, well, no, that's what you're looking for when you're looking for diversity. So I think organizations really need to think of, boards really need to think about, how do they bring those diverse board members onto their board? How do they embed them? How do they make them feel welcome? There's sort of growing data now that those organizations that take a tokenistic approach to diversity, tick the box, are then seeing those directors churn more quickly, add less value, create more dissatisfaction. So I think it's a key thing that organizations need to think about. The second is really around the growth mindset. And as you relate, I can think of an example where, again, it was a sort of chair looking at a candidate, and their response was, they're delusional. They're not gonna sit on a board. And then actually, when you started digging down into what did that particular candidate bring, and sort of explained their deep functional expertise in an area that the board hadn't yet considered, they did a complete volte-face and said, my gosh, we've got to hire them. And I think sometimes boards can get themselves into a position where they think they know everything, and it's keeping that growth mindset. And we see that in the data, actually, for board members who are interested in going on courses, educational courses. Very few are interested in doing it. It's the people who are not yet on boards who want to go do the courses. Those on boards already think they know everything. So I suppose my call to action, besides educating yourself on how to bring on new diverse board members, is keep learning, keep being curious.
Good point. Thank you. Malin?
Yeah, I would agree with Oliver, and I would also like to add that I believe that in the future boards will be more important, not less, but they will be important if they keep learning, if they're curious, and if they really engage with the company that they are working for. They really need to understand the purpose. They need to share the vision, and also share a belief in the future with the company in order to be successful. And I think that's different. I also think there's a risk with all of this that we start seeing too large boards, which I think is it can work in certain organizations, but in very many organizations, actually is value decreasing and decreases efficiency. And I also believe that we might maybe even need to consider more, changing board members more frequently, at least parts of them, in order to keep up with this.
Thank you, Malin. Neem, last points of advice for our audience.
Sure. Well, we would say, and it's certainly something that we've seen kind of boards practically focus on, is ensure that they've got the right information to support them, and that, importantly, their board papers are fit for purpose and are focused on the right things. And then cascade that way of thinking via the executive throughout the organization, that insight really driven by questions. And interestingly, look at it a different way. So board papers to us are the tip of the iceberg. They are symptomatic, and if the board feels that their board papers aren't hitting the mark, that is very, very often indicative of something else in the organization that isn't functioning as well as it could. If as a board and as a management team, you dig that out and you solve that, a better board and better board papers are a happy byproduct.
Absolutely, cannot agree with that more, because that's where quality discussion starts. So I would like to thank all of you for your fantastic contributions and sharing with us the insights of how boards can be just a bit better prepared for the unknown, because that goes to the heart of today's definition of an agile, effective, and fit for purpose board. So would like to thank you from London Stock Exchange, would like to thank our audience, and a reminder that this webinar will continue to live on Spark Live. Have a nice day, everybody.